a masterful, highly organized, carefully crafted offensive by the present on the past. This is the central theme we will analyze on a book banned for over 20 years and now boasting a turbulent publication path. I'm talking about Snail on the Slope by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Let's get this book undone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and today I bring a curiously absurdist and highly allegorical book to discuss. Snail on the Slope by the Strugatsky Brothers, Arkady and Boris. I found this book on a second-hand bookstore and purchased it because these authors have been on my to-read list for a long while. Reading it was a ride, and I want to share my analysis with you. Yet before we get started, allow me to tackle the usual disclaimers. First, there are spoilers in this episode. I found it very hard to explain the theme of a book without diving into its setting and plot. So we will do a summary on that first, then establish a few related concepts, then move into the analysis. Second, in his afterword to the SF Masterwork edition, Boris Strugatsky pointed out that although the administration forest allegory had one clear intent, there have been many other sensible explanations out there. Ultimately, that's the power of allegories, that each reader can add meaning to it. Therefore, if you don't resonate with the idea I'm presenting here, then that's okay. We can all have different interpretations. Now, for those who don't know the Strugatsky brothers, Arkady and Boris, they were born in 1925 and 1933, respectively. Their writing style is considered to have emerged from the period of Soviet rationalism in their contemporary literature and rapidly evolved to social criticism masquerading as science fiction. They started writing in the mid 1950s and published at least 26 novels in addition to short stories, plays, and a few works written individually. There is a 1967 poll claiming that 4 out of the top 10 works of science fiction in the Soviet Union were by the Strugatskys. So you can imagine they were incredibly famous. Their most renowned novel, Roadside Picnic, was adapted in 1979 into the film Stalker, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. It is often considered to be the greatest science fiction film ever made. That is not a small praise. Likewise, their novel Hard to Be a God, 1964, was also adapted into a highly praised film, this time by Russian filmmaker Alexei German. Something interesting about them is that their writing prior to 1964 was informed by the post-Stalinist thaw, a period which included a general liberalization of Soviet life, leading to a political and cultural openness when it seemed like the socialist dream may still be possible. During this period, the Strugatskys' work was somewhat optimistic. However, that changed in 1964 when Leonid Brezhnev displaced Nikita Khrushchev as Soviet leader, reversing most of his reforms. They published Hard to Be a God in that year, which I mentioned before, and this was actually a novel replete with themes of terror and political repression. Their books grew darker from there, to the point the Strugatskys became dissidents of the Soviet regime, using literary science fiction as a way to slip by the censors and publish books that would otherwise be banned. Their work was so critical that when Boris, the younger brother, died in 1991, the New York Times called him a prolific writer who used the genre of science fiction to voice criticisms of Soviet life that would have been unthinkable in other literary forms. It was during Brezhnev's period that the Strugatskys published Snail on the Slope, or at least attempted to. They began working on it during March 6th to 20th, 1965, but then it was significantly rewritten. In 1966, the USSR published only the chapters set in the forest, and the remaining bit, set in the administration, in 1968. But they were later pulled from libraries and put into a restricted access collection. The book was banned from then on and only published entirely for the first time in 1972 in Germany. The first English translation by Alan Myers was released in 1980 and, funny as it sounds, it was not published as a whole in the USSR until 1988, exactly 20 years after it was originally banned. Why was it banned? We will dive into that meaning soon, but something to know is that the Strugatsky brothers became known for writing highly allegorical literary science fiction in an attempt to circumvent Soviet censors. It became their signature style, using figurative and symbolic meaning to express their philosophical vision while crafting stories that were incredibly relatable but subtle at the same time. That highly allegorical and volatile style led to its censorship. Allow me to read an excerpt from the afterword of the SF Masterwork edition written by Boris Strugatsky himself. The multitude of possible readings didn't do The Snail on the Slope much good. The novel didn't get destroyed per se, but for many years it was forbidden. In May 1969, a certain V. Alexandrov devoted the following remarkable lines to our novel. The authors do not state where the action takes place, but the entirety of their narrative makes it absolutely clear what country they mean. Snail on the Slope has a turbulent history, but the Strugatskys themselves consider it as the most perfect and the most valuable of their works. There must be something there in a book so highly regarded and so consistently banned, don't you think? To get us started in its analysis, let me summarize the setting of A Snail on the Slope. Half of the chapters happen in the administration and the other half in the forest. The administration is an administrative compound set high in the mountains. It has a number of divisions, such as the Forest Eradication Team, the Armed Guard of the Forest Team, the Penetration of the Forest through Engineering Team, and the Scientific Guard of the Forest Team. All of this is led by the director, and apparently, people need a visa to reach the administration and stay there. They have shared canteens, eat all at the same time, are given buttermilk quite often, and have a cliff that oversees the forest itself. There is not much of an explanation as to what else is beyond the administration. The forest, on the other hand, is on the valley down the slope, and it is messy. The villages there are generally quite primitive and stalked by deadlings, some grass-made plant-like beings, very vaguely described, that can be killed with grass killer and often steal women. At completely unplanned moments, the villages undergo something called the surpassment, a somewhat undefinable event which may be a flood, a wildfire, or even something else. There are plenty of in-book myths about the surpassment. There are other places in the forest, such as the clay meadows, the cook village, the reeds, the ant hills, but nobody really knows where they are and how to get there. They all know the forest is dangerous. To top it, within the villages, there is an unnamed old man that goes into people's houses uninvited, eats their lunch, and everybody seems okay with this, feeding him and never complaining about it. Not long ago, I mentioned this novel was written during Brezhnev's leadership, 1964-1982, a period in Russian history that later became known as the era of stagnation. It wasn't truly totalitarian, not in the Stalinist sense, but it was hostile to free thought, suppressing dissent through means that were not mass terror, but bureaucratic absurdity, with rules nobody understood, goals nobody questioned, and structures nobody believed in. That context is somewhat reflected in this book. The administration is clearly a bureaucratic behemoth with themes that make no sense. They have both eradication and guard of the forest. Processes that are illogical, a chain of command that is never clarified, and places within the buildings that are physical mazes, as if echoing the labyrinthine processes it harbors. Likewise, the forest is utterly confusing. There are all these places that nobody knows where they are exactly, just that they are somewhere, dead links with no purpose or goal, people that will somewhat connect to something and become a living radio. It is sheer nonsense, intended nonsense. Within those settings, we follow two distinct and seemingly unconnected storylines. Peret's story happens in the administration. He is a philologist and historian that arrived in a visa to the administration and works for a man named Kim, basically copying numbers every day. However, he came to this old place from somewhere outside of it, some place unnamed, just to visit the forest, something he cannot do because he is on a visa, which soon expires but nobody cares. Peretz is always carrying his luggage wherever he goes, although he never opens it, and always complaining he wants to visit the forest and is not allowed to. He's also hunted by a man called Butley Cherson who works on the eradication team. Candid's story happens in the forest. Candid was actually a helicopter pilot that used to work for the administration in the scientific guard team. One day, during his flight above the forest, he crashed into some sort of invisible barrier and fell to the ground. He was rescued by some villagers, taken to their village, and married to a young woman called Nava. The story begins 3 years after that, with Candide still trapped there. He is trying to convince a cripple called Crookleg to tell him how to get to the city, aka the administration atop the slope. The two plot lines never cross, except for whenever administration people tell Peretz about Candide's accident. However, everyone there seems to consider that Candide is dead, even though no body was found and no efforts made to rescue him. There is something curious about the characters' names. In Russian, Peretz literally translates to pepper, perhaps suggesting some spice in the author's social takes of the Soviet Union. However, Peretz also has a meaning in Hebrew. It translates to breach or breakthrough, thus adding into the overall allegory. This hidden meaning can also be read within the plot. Namely, we rapidly notice that the administration is a bureaucratic behemoth, and given Peretz's status as a visitor, we could think he brings some quote unquote spice that would lead to a breakthrough. But there is more than that. The other character is Candide, and that name also has two meanings. One, the word itself translates to innocent or naive in English, and through the story, we see a lot of innocence on Candide's part. Second, it is a reference to Voltaire's magnus opus, Candide or l'Optimisme, a French satire published in 1759 during the Age of Enlightenment. It was subjected to both great scandal and great success, since Voltaire's character is a progression from blind faith to disillusionment and to somewhat pragmatic resignation. While the Strugatsky's Candide shares the optimism, he focuses on procedure and order while living in a maze of incompetence and vagueness. Regardless, to assume the administration forest duality is just a parody of Russian bureaucracy somewhat falls short of the potential of this book's allegory. Granted, you can read it like so, but in my subjective opinion, there are far more interesting and spicy takes. As Adam Roberts said in his foreword, what the forest represents, then, is reality's resistance to reduction, the way things are always more complex, always larger and more baffling that can be accommodated with our descriptions of them. How can the forest be, quoting, reality's resistance to reduction? Let me walk you through the clues I gathered while reading the book. Snail on the Slope starts with Perez sitting in the edge of the cliff before being assessed by Butley Cherson due to seemingly deviant behavior, namely wanting to visit the forest. After a strange conversation, the pair walks through the maze of buildings towards the canteen, while Perez thinks that you couldn't see the forest from here, but the forest was present, although you could only see it from the cliff. If you were anywhere else in the administration, it was obscured by something. We can take that cliff, literally, as the edge that divides the administration from the forest being unclimbable from below and promising certain death if you drop from above. Or allegorically, as a small space in which the clutter and nonsense of the administration, of daily life, are not present. A private, to some extent, enclosure where Perez had time to think and wander outside the chaos of his life. Yet that fragment also hints that the forest looms over the administration, always present and surrounding, also not visible. Wherever you go, you know the forest is around, even when not visible. Since the administration houses a lot of people, I began thinking that the forest had to be something that affected more than one person. An abstract concept, maybe, something that exists but it is intangible. But what could that abstract concept be? I held on to the question as the chapter followed Perez into the office, a chaotic mayhem of people coming and going, and a boss that requested calculations for an opaque process. And it reminded me of something. Think of your daily life, those days at your 9 to 5 job in which there is just so much happening that you cannot even spare a moment to think about how you feel. Hell, sometimes you can barely scramble a moment to rush to the toilet. You can forget about the whole world, even those pressing concerns that won't let you sleep at night. But in those few precious moments of peace, your feelings, concerns, and ideas will slip back in like a breath of fresh air. That is exactly what happens to Perez. Whenever he's busy in the administration, he forgets about his intention to visit the forest. But then, when he has a moment of peace, he remembers it. From there, my premature interpretation was that the administration actually symbolizes the present. If so, the forest, quote unquote, looming over, had to be the past. What happened shortly after that revelation and after the first quote was actually quite pepperish, if I dare say, and helped me refine this idea. Let's move on with the plot. Still following Perez, we find out that his visa has expired and that he's been expelled at midnight from the hotel where he stays. This can be a metaphor of the uncertainty that arrives at the most unthinkable moment. Thus, our now homeless protagonist is thrown into a cold night at the mercy of the uncontrollable weather, loses his suitcase, there is more to it than you can imagine, tries to find it again and gets lost in the darkness, things keep happening to us, and then falls to the ground, where, figuratively, he is now at his lowest point. All of those events, those little metaphors I was pointing out, can be an allegory of life being awful at a given moment, something that, unfortunately, has likely happened to all of us at some point. Yet, when everything stabilizes, Perez realizes he's now at the cliff where the forest looms. If we are reading the administration as a present and the forest as a past, the cliff is the edge upon which the present looks at the past, namely recalling memories. And this is exactly what we all do when life is hitting us badly. We start pondering, how did we get here? And thus revisit our previous choices and the prior events that brought us here. Doing so is pretty common. We all try to either A, ask what if, such as if I had done this differently, or if I had studied a different career, or B, try to find reassurance that our current situation was inevitable or not our fault. Yet doing that, it is almost pointless. We can learn from our mistakes, but we can't change the past. As Perez himself thinks, finally sitting near the cliff, but the forest remained indifferent. It was so indifferent it wasn't even visible. There was nothing but darkness beneath the cliff. No matter how hard we think, we can't really change the past, or can we? That is a question we must ponder in order to continue reading and analyzing Snail on the Slope. After that quaint statement, Perret seemingly forgets his misadventures and goes into a monologue aimed at the forest. He says, "Wake up! Look at me just this once! I don't know what you are like. No one knows that, least of all those who are absolutely certain that they know. You are the way you are, but I can still hope that you are the way I have wanted you to be my whole life. Wise and good, tolerant and long memoried, observant and maybe even grateful. We have lost all these things. We only build monuments, bigger, taller, cheaper monuments. But memories? We no longer have any memories. Focus on, I don't know what you are like. No one knows that. Which is true for the past, but most of all, it is true for the collective past, which we call history. History is uncertain. It is made up of clues, blurrer and blurrer the farther behind we go. And if we know anything with certainty, it is mostly because there is a single source for it. The more we uncover, for example, through archaeology or anthropology, the less certain we become of our own history. As Professor Mark Damon wrote for the University of Utah, history is not just what really happened in the past, but a complex intersection of truths, biases, and hopes. This intersection has actually led to plenty of problems with historians embedding their own biases on the interpretation of whatever they found. Yet the following sentence adds to this. Perez says, no one knows that, least of all those who are absolutely certain that they know. You can read that as conspiracy theories or people that parrot a so called truth without having a basis for it, those who explain everything through faith, or even those who simply lie so convincingly everybody believes them. Take it to the extreme and consider why we need fact checkers, because nowadays many public figures twist past events to their convenience and whatever ideology they belong to. Coupled with the internet providing us with so many truths, finding out the actual truth is almost near impossible. Now, consider that this book was written during the Russian era of stagnation, which, although not totalitarian, it sought ideological conformity. Historically, and without getting into details, as David K. Shipler explained for the New York Times, Brezhnev's era tried to impose a tougher internal order, reversing some of the liberalizing intellectual and political tendencies of Khrushchev, and even putting a growing pressure against artistic and political expression that deviated from the party view. With that, we may start noticing the pepper in all of this. Like Orwell wrote in 1984, who controls the past controls the future, because by doing so, one government can A. Hide the fact that before may have actually been better than now, B. Create a model record that actually serves their purposes, and C reframe historical figures out of sheer convenience to squash dissident voices. But it doesn't stop there. In the next beat, Perez says to the forest, "You are the way you are, but I can still hope that you are the way I have wanted you to be my whole life, wise and good, tolerant and long memoried, observant and maybe grateful." I think each of us has at least once met someone still bedazzled about the good old days. Whether those were the 50s, the 60s, the 80s, and their amazing music, there is always someone thinking that prior times were better because, quote unquote, these things didn't happen back then. There is also another well known truth. Time smoothes the edges of imperfection, and so we tend to forget the rough parts of our past, often minimizing it because now, in the present, they do not remain as important as they were before. This is known as idealization, a mental process in which a person exaggerates the positive qualities and minimizes the imperfections in themselves or others. We tend to do that to the past quite often, even to our own personal past, thinking that we were better before simply because we forgot how awful some things actually were. But Peretz doesn't stop there, telling the forest that we only build monuments, bigger, taller, cheaper monuments, but memories, we no longer have any memories. So history exists, namely the forest continues to loom over, but the present, namely the administration, doesn't really have memories of it. If we backtrack a bit from that scene before Peret's visa ended abruptly, we can review a strange conversation between our protagonist and his boss, Mr. Kim. Kim asks, "Why do you want the bitter truth? What are you going to do with it? And what are you going to do in the forest? Weep for a dream that has become fate? Pray for everything to be different?" There are a few clues there, but pay attention to this bit. Why do you want the bitter truth? Pray for everything to be different? Let me ask you something. What will happen if something that we believe to be true our whole life, especially something about the past, like an event or a public figure, is demonstrated irrevocably to be a lie? Say that someone demonstrate that this past event or figure was not really as good or as moral as we were made to believe. Chances are one of two things will happen, or both maybe. One, we despair because this fundamental belief is now markedly wrong and we have evidence for it. Two, we turn the blind eye, ignoring the truth and continuing to live the lie while making some mental gymnastics to explain the unexplainable for one simple reason: the temptation of comfort over clarity, narrative over truth, and the participation in delusion over the shame of waking up. Peretz actually says this to the forest in his monologue. He says that those believers are only missing one thing, the capacity to understand. They always found substitutes for understanding: faith, atheism, indifference, contempt, remarking that it is easier to believe than to understand. If you take it that way, everyone taking path two, namely ignoring the truth and choosing the lie, becomes guilty of perpetuating the lie. And here is where the Strugatsky's pepper comes in. Unlike Orwell's 1984 or Moore's V for Vendetta or many other dystopias, Snail on the Slope was not blaming the government but the people, not as villains, but as agents of the normalization. Whatever type of government it is, people prop up systems not because they believe in them fully, but because it hurts too much to admit they never did and thus recognize they were wrong. In my opinion, that is far subtler and unsettling than a top down critique. But there is more to this, and to keep uncovering the meaning, we must jump to the forest and follow Candid's storyline for a bit. He wakes up to the stranger, that old unnamed man, arriving to his house to eat his lunch, because that's what he does. After exchanging a few words and without trying to expel the intruder, Candid departs his own house while repeating that he will leave the day after tomorrow, even though he's still in the village after 3 years. Thus, he goes to talk to Crookleg, a cripple who had his adventures in the forest. Crookleg explains the path to take like so. The city! That's where you are heading. But, Silent Man, there is no way to get to the city. If you wanted to go to the Clay Meadow, say, that's no problem. Go past the stones, through the Cook village, and the Clay Meadow will be right there. You should have told me right away that you wanted to go to the Reeds. But I can't make it to the Ant Hills. I will make it there myself, and I will take you there too. But you aren't going to the Ant Hills. You are going to the Reeds. But I can't go to the Reeds. I won't make it. That excerpt is actually a heavily summarized version of a meandering conversation that happens across 4 pages. It goes on and on and on, and it doesn't matter how many times Candid repeats he wants to go to the city, namely the administration. Crookleg keeps deviating and seemingly forgetting what the other man requests. Do you know what's worse? Candid's patience. He doesn't seem irritated, frustrated, or anything. He simply, patiently, tries to redirect Crookleg to remember he wants to go back to the administration. So you will take me to the city? You told me no one but you knows the way to the city. Let's go to the city, Crookleg. Can we make it to the city, you think? Yet Crookleg keeps meandering about until Candid departs, visits 2 other people, and the chapter and day ends up with Candid reminding himself, that is what I have to remember. The day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, he thought. The day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow. Not a very productive conversation, and certainly not one that speaks highly of Candid himself. Yet the meandering and confusing nature of everything that happens in the forest is part of the allegory, something that takes another meaning when we start considering our present past duality. In the next chapter, Candid finally goes to the forest by himself. He begins walking through the main path, and after a few hours, he realizes what the reader experimented in his previous chapter, that while he's on the village, his thoughts are rambly and vegetative. His narrator begins to change, the sentences become more structured, and Candid finally thinks, maybe it was the effect of this drowsy way of life, not even primitive but downright vegetative, that he'd been forced to lead. He recalls how his helicopter crashed and how he was rescued, eventually having an epiphany. If I hadn't been thrown out, I would have drowned in the swamp, so it was actually a good thing that I was thrown out. It suddenly dawned on him that these were deductions and he was delighted. Allow me to reread the last sentence. It suddenly dawned on him that these were deductions and he was delighted. In other words, while being around the rambling villagers, Candide slowly lost his ability to reason and thus make deductions. Once he was out of the village, even for a moment, his old self seemed to return. There is no magic here, and certainly not a disease. What's happening to Candide is a key part of a snail on the slope, a phenomenon called social assimilation. According to the APA Dictionary of Psychology, social assimilation is the process by which two or more cultures or cultural groups are gradually merged, although one is likely to remain dominant. Within this context, an individual's assimilation can be understood as the process by which an immigrant to a new culture adopts the culture's beliefs and practices. Namely, Candide was giving up to the nonsense and slowly adapting to the villagers' ways, even though it made no sense. Allow me to quote Orwell's 1984 again. A lunatic was simply a minority of one. And does it matter whether this quote unquote lunatic actually believes the truth? No, it doesn't really. What matters, what always unfortunately matters, is the perception of the majority. Yet that lunatic is never suddenly converted into the majority. The change happens ever so slowly, accepting one belief, then another, then replacing what we believed was true until we start believing we always thought in this way. This is not a loss of intelligence, but a loss of context due to social assimilation. In this case, the forest's meaning as a collective past, namely a society's history, is not just what happened, the actual facts, but also the consequence of forgetting, where nothing makes sense and everybody keeps wondering about, not to admit they stopped paying attention, to how others twisted history, to how records were rewritten, to how new truths scattered. Yet while Candide begins to assimilate into the villagers, whether he wants it or not, Peretz seems to resist this process. He secures an appointment with the director of the administration to beg for him to be allowed to leave the administration. Of course, Peretz attends the appointment along his trusty luggage, cueing several pages of mayhem as he goes from meeting an impostor director to be thrown into curling corridors, all while screaming he wants out. Amidst the darkness, he's forced to sign a document, then expelled from a building and hauled into a car with his colleagues, traveling to the outpost of the scientific guard of the forest. After a few moments, they realize Perez has no permit to visit the forest, and so they conduct an absurd test to grant it. And upon arrival, nobody assesses that permit. Yet the point here is not only how nonsensical everything is, but how little everyone, except Perez, worries about those strange events in the administration. The absurdity is not concealed, it is routine. In a system that has severed its ties to a coherent past, people complete their daily rituals and accept those that happen around them because they have always been there and that is the norm. Remember, the Strugatskys were criticizing the people as those who normalize this twisted, nonsensical state, allowing the past to be now just a mess. Peret's inner debacle and confusion marks him as Orwell's lunatic, the only one aware of the nonsense the administration's present everyone has adapted to. His point of view, along his resistance to be assimilated, becomes a bit clearer when he finally arrives to the outpost of the scientific guard of the forest. Once out of a van and with his luggage at hand, Peretz thinks, but the most impossible objects in this thicket were people. They walked with ease, never stumbling, instantly finding where to step, and they pretended not to notice the forest, to be at home in the forest, and they probably weren't even pretending. They really did feel that way. Meanwhile, the forest loomed over them, shaking with silent laughter, pointing at them with a myriad mocking fingers, cleverly pretending to be familiar, obedient, and simple. There is so much to unpack here. The administration employees in the outpost walked with ease, never stumbling, because they have been socially assimilated. If you think that the administration is not only the present, but the current narrative of the past, the quote unquote walking around the outpost becomes repeating the speech they were taught. Thus, they pretended not to notice the forest, to be at home in the forest, can be read as those moments in which believers of a lie will repeat it over and over because that's what they have learned. But notice the specific wording here. They pretended not to notice a forest. As we mentioned before, agreeing to these beliefs is not a loss of intelligence, but a loss of context. Plenty of times and in a myriad of situations, we can witness something that is happening and disregard it entirely simply because we don't have enough context or knowledge to understand what we are looking at. That is what Peretz meant when he added, they probably weren't even pretending, they really did feel that way. Nothing is easier to believe than a lie everyone shares, especially when the truth will shatter not just certainty, but the comfort of belonging. Yet here comes the ironic bit. Meanwhile, the forest loomed over them, shaking with silent laughter, pointing at them with myriad mocking fingers. While you can read this as a forest being alive, this sentence can actually mean far more in the context of censored history. What if, because it happened across history and will keep happening, plenty of people, now dead or extricated, warned that if things were to continue, then the administration was the only destination? Could we read this as those who issued warnings now laughing from their graves in a sad, ironic, I told you so? While I will not tell you what happens to parrots, it could be an episode of its own, allow me to briefly resume Candid's story. After his journey through the forest, Candid finally witnesses one of the mysterious surpassments reaching a specific village. What actually happens is that water comes in from nowhere, sinks the settlement, and literally erases all traces of it until only a lake remains. After watching that, and finally on his way back, Candide thinks the following. But I don't know what the surpassment is. I'm afraid of it. I'm disgusted by it, but that's merely because it is alien to me, and perhaps the correct phrase is a masterful, highly organized, carefully crafted offensive by the present on the past, and maybe even a recently mature and invigorated present attacking an obsolete, routine past at that. Not depravity, but a revolution, a law of nature. What Candide seems to be grappling with is the possibility that the surpassment is not a mistake, but a deliberate erasure of what was and no longer serves a purpose for the administration. Namely, the settlement within the forest will be a specific past event that is now being deleted and rewritten as a lake, aka as something acceptable to the administration. Yet he is specific on his feelings. I am afraid of it. I'm disgusted by it, but pulls back and rephrases that carefully crafted offensive into a recently mature and invigorated present attacking an obsolete routine past. In other words, Candide is doing a bit of mental gymnastics, trying to find a way to justify what feels truly unjustifiable because otherwise the moral crisis will be too high and costly for himself. He thinks that perhaps it is not a corrupt administration erasing the bits of history that doesn't serve it. Maybe it is just a system renewing itself by violently discarding the past, the forest, in order to define the present. In his own words, not depravity, but a revolution, a law of nature. What looks like depravity may have actually be ideological necessity, namely history rewritten as rot and memory cast as an obstacle. This is Candide, just like so many other people, reaching for a frame that explains the systematic erasure of our history, even if it means giving up on truth and morality entirely. I will leave it there, but there are a few other themes to mention that I did not have time or space to cover in this podcast episode. Peret's Lugash can be read as his sense of self and purpose, the last piece of him that insists he is not part of the administration. He clings to it while he refuses to be assimilated, but once he does, the Lugash simply vanishes. There are a lot of echoes and contradictions between the Strugatsky's Candide and Voltaire's, and you could analyze his arc only based on the differences and similarities. You could also analyze each of the character arcs, namely Peret's and Candide's, in terms of how they relate to the social assimilation of their relative contexts. I only mentioned the unnamed old man that visits villages and eats people's food. You could read that as laws or customs that make no sense, but that people keep accepting them because, quoting, they have always been there. There is even something worse. The old man criticizes everyone, and that can also be studied. A quaint detail is that the administration has a patriarchal structure, while the forest is matriarchal. There is a whole storyline around the deadlings and Nava, Candide's child wife, and how her mother became a maiden, changing the forest for plans obscure to everyone but the maidens. You can make a whole read on this based on the inequalities that Soviet women faced despite the professed ideals of gender equality. Actually, there are a few interesting papers on this, and I will link one in the transcript. If any of these topics interest you, feel free to let me know in the comments. I definitely consider doing a second episode about the snail on the slope. Before we go, do you want to know what was Strugatsky's intended meaning? They imagined the forest as the unknown future. Kim hinted at it on the very same excerpt I quoted. And what are you going to do in the forest? Weep for a dream that has become fate? We can easily consider that as the many times we spend wanting something to happen. For example, when I purchase a house, when I finish a degree, when I get married, or when the kids finish college. We are always constantly dreaming of the future, even though there is no way we can make sense of it. Hence, why Krokleg's indications are muddled. If we remember that the Strugatsky's Candide is a reference to Voltaire's Candide, then we can get even more. Maybe faith in progress, Voltaire's original target, was replaced here with blind faith in systems, a blind trust that someone, the director or the maidens maybe, know what is going on, even as everything clearly doesn't. This will also link back to Candide's final reflection, in which he does these mental gymnastics precisely to reinforce his trust on the leadership. Furthermore, very early at the start, the proconsul tells Peretz, "What a marvel the forest is, my friends. It elevates us, it awakens our loftiest sentiments, it encourages progress, it is like a symbol of progress itself." And isn't that what propaganda ultimately is? Loads of promises of action to be taken of whatever type as a mean to achieve an idealized version of the future. What those actions are and what that promised future looks like will depend on your time, on your country, and what your biases and beliefs are. Yet the allegory, as either the past or the future, stands nonetheless. That is the precise problem of a snail on the slope. If you read literally, just taking what's happening in the page without wondering what were the Strugatskys hiding from the censors, it can be quite nonsensical. But the moment you give meaning to the administration for duality and start reading everything under that lens, it becomes quite an incendiary book. The type of book that often gets banned. As a fake director said to Parrot, this book was destroyed, of course, as befits a work of art that cannot be allowed to have ambiguous interpretations. A final word of advice. The Strugatskys wrote this book in Russian, and so if you are picking it in English, the translation matters. Myers was a bit more lyrical, but Vormashenko's is actually a more truthful translation of the many old idioms used by the Strugatskys. If you can, procure the SF Masterwork version. It includes both a foreword by Adam Roberts and the Boris Strugatsky's afterword, which I quoted in this episode. That said, if you like this episode, please like and subscribe, review the podcast, and let's continue the discussion in the comments. If you want bite sized deep dives, prose analysis, and updates on my own writing, please subscribe to my newsletter through Substack at liviajelliot.substack.com. As a bonus for subscribing, you will get the free ebook of my novella titled The Genesis of Change. It is grim, dark, and its magic system is based on philosophy. I will leave a link to subscribe to my newsletter in the description. Thanks for listening and happy reading.